He's not our usual guest from Hodgson Russ, Dan Spitzer, but because he's their resident expert at Hodgson Russ on the Inflation Reduction Act, or as another colleague calls it, the climate bill in sheep's clothing. We'd like to welcome our colleague from Hodgson Russ, Joseph.
So hi everyone, my name is Joe Reckroot. I'm a tax lawyer at Hodgson Russ. And like was just said, I'm here to talk to you about the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, as a lot of people have taken to calling it. Be careful when you're talking to your lawyers and you say the word IRA, because it can cause some confusion. It's caused a lot of confusion with the non-tax lawyers in our firm. Exactly. But so yeah, today we're going to talk about energy and credits and incentives after the passage of the IRA. Quick agenda for you. First, we have a pretty diverse group here, so we're going to talk about just some of the big hits of what the IRA changed. We're going to talk about some questions answered by the IRA and some of the monumental shifts. And then we're going to talk about what kind of guidance we can expect the IRS to be issuing, and what questions practitioners are still trying to work through. In a way, I'm glad that we had some, kind of very good monumental, presentations before this one, because instead of having to wake you up with tax, I can just try to not put you to sleep with tax, which is a little easier. We'll see if I can manage it. This is a lot to cover. We could probably talk for 2 hours about this stuff. So the 20-minute timeline is going to be pretty prohibitive in terms of questions, I think, if we want to stay on track. I'll try to get some time at the end for audience questions, but the nature of this is that a lot of these questions end up being fairly complex, so happy to answer via email or phone afterwards. I have my info on the last slide, happy to hand it out. But with that, let's talk about kind of what the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, has done. And the first big thing is expanding and extending the base credits. A lot of you are probably familiar, I'm assuming, already with the ITC, PTC, clean energy vehicle credits. So the first thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is expanding the base credits, both in terms of their length and in terms of their size. The second thing is this new concept of prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, which a lot of you probably have been trying to think through and work through. Generally, for those of you who aren't familiar what this is, for the ITC and the PTC, the IRS decided to break them down. Instead of being just a singular credit, they're now almost a two-part credit, where you access the base credit, which is the first 20% of the credit, without having to meet any requirements, but in order to get to that extra 80%, to bring you to the full 100% of the credit, you need to meet both prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And what that means, just quickly, obviously, this is super complicated. Guidance is still coming out. I went to an hour talk on just this topic the other day, so we can't fully cover it here, but at the very base level, prevailing wage is kind of what you'd expect for all of the work that's happening on the project. You need to be paying a prevailing wage for the area in which the project's located, and that's for your employees, contractors, subcontractors, which can get kind of difficult, and how are we documenting that? Those are some of the things we'll start to talk about a little bit later. There's also some grandfathering of this requirement, because obviously this is a huge thing, right? If you're talking about 20% of the credit, which is 6% in terms of a credit figure, versus 30%, when you're a tax owner talking to investors, that's going to be a huge thing. And so people are trying to work this out and contract into this. Some people are grandfathered in if you started construction on your project before the end of January. I think technically it's January 29th. You don't have to worry about these requirements, but everybody else who's starting construction after that point, you are going to have to worry about it, and you're going to have to start asking these questions. There are also some kind of mitigation provisions. We won't get into too much here, but that's generally the base change with prevailing wage and apprenticeship. Also, the IRS has added in some nice bonuses, which have caused a lot of fanfare. A lot of people have been talking about them. First, the domestic content bonus basically just requires that you are using in your project certain amounts of U.S.-made materials. It's a percentage of the cost of your steel, your iron, and your manufactured products have to be manufactured or coming from the U.S. Now, what U.S. production means is still kind of being flushed out. The IRS helpfully just gave us a nice, well, look at 49 CFR 661, and everyone said, thanks. Not very helpful. So guidance is still coming out, but that's generally, what that bonus is. Energy and low-income communities, a similar sort of thing. Here we see, the U.S. trying to influence where these projects are being located. Energy communities, things like brownfield sites, low-income communities, places that historically have relied on fossil fuel extraction and have, a significant number of folks who are under, or a significant high numbers of average unemployment. Locating projects there is going to allow you to access another bonus credit for the ITC and the PTC, which is what we're going to be mainly talking about today. There's also, a huge number of other changes, clean vehicle credits, all sorts of things buried in the IRA that we're not going to talk about today. But regardless, this is a huge passage of law that, people are now trying to work through. So some of the questions answered and kind of incentives provided by the IRA before we get into what we still don't know. The first is, expanded timeframes and larger credits. Most of my work is ITC, some PTC, so I've kind of included some ITC metrics here about what the credit looks like, how you access it. But in terms of expanding the credit, which is what we see here, they've also extended it. I think now the ITC goes through 2032, or if later, when the U.S. reached certain reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So really, they're kind of extending that time frame, and that's really how these credits have worked since their inception. The first energy credit was put into the code in '78, and when it came out, it was a 4-year credit, and they extended that until the first permanent credit, or at least long-standing credit, got put into the code in '92. So this is, kind of a common story for how these credits work, but the IRA is them doing it again. Another massive question that was answered, and one that I know we have some folks, maybe even a couple minutes, we're going to be talking about, at least this technology, is standalone storage and its eligibility on its own for the ITC. It's been a long-standing issue. I have a small excerpt from a slide deck that I did, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago. I think it was to New York Best or someone like that in this industry, because for a long time, standalone storage had to be paired with, a PTC wind or solar project or something like that in order to be ITC eligible, but that's no longer the case, which is, a monumental shift. It gives you the ability to be, I think, more financially efficient. How much this is actually going to matter, how much standalone project credit work we're going to see, I don't know. I'm not totally sold. The people in this room might know better than I do. But because of the next thing we're going to talk about, which is credit transfers, I think these credit transfers might be where the bulk of attention goes as opposed to standalone storage. But, we'll kind of have to wait and see. The final big change is credit transferability, which is, absolutely huge for anyone who's doing projects. Generally, the IRA permits, as you can see on the slide, for 2023 to 2032, eligible taxpayers who are those that don't qualify for direct pay, which is something we're not going to be covering too in depth here. But eligible taxpayers can transfer a portion of their credits to unrelated, taxpayers, which is, great. There are obviously some restrictions. Payment has to be in cash. Only one transfer of the credits is allowed. You can't have, successive transfers. But this allows pretty easy and readily, available monetization of credits, more so than some of the structures that we typically see in these portfolio investments, whether you're doing partnership flips or reverse leases. This is going to, I think, radically shift how this financing is done. Some people call it the great rethink, but that's a massive change that the IRA has put into place. And I guess before we move on, one interesting thing about these credit transfers from a tax perspective is how states are going to work through these, because obviously, as you all likely know, states differ in how they conform to the Internal Revenue Code and federal tax rules. I'm not a state tax lawyer, and generally New York is pretty, ITC, energy, renewable friendly. But New York has, in certain instances, decoupled from certain federal programs, the Opportunity Zone program being one good example. So it'll be interesting to see how states deal with these credit transfer transactions, especially because I think things are going to get fairly creative is maybe the way that we'll leave it for the purposes of this presentation. So that'll be one thing, especially obviously for a lot of us here in New York, to see how New York deals with it. This slide, you don't have to, worry about too much. I include it mostly in case some of you have questions that I don't cover as open questions during this presentation. What this is, these are some of the notices, because how the IRS works when large packages of new law come out is they'll ask, industry people for comments, right? They'll ask tax professionals, they'll ask people in the space, and these are some of the notices that have come out where the IRS has done so about the changes in the IRA. This first notice, 2022-49, is the IRS asking for guidance on 45 and 48 credits, including the ITC, and the changes that they've made. We've seen a lot of people already give their feedback. I think, Elevate in Illinois had a pretty good, commentary in response to that notice, where they talk about everything from, nonprofit involvement in credit transfers to pretty granular definitions that the IRS hasn't yet had a chance to kind of define. Similar vein, 2022-40, I won't go through all of them, but 2022-51, that one requests comments on all the stuff we were just talking about, prevailing wage, the bonuses. And so if you have questions about how any of those are going to be implemented, you can even get as simple as putting that notice number into Google with, comment or something like that in quotation marks, and you can get access to some of these responses to see if at least others are thinking about the questions that you have, because there's been a lot of good work put in. The guidance from the IRS is going to be very slow coming out. It's begun to do so. At the end of last year, it put out some basic prevailing wage guidelines. About a month ago, it put out some low-income bonus guidance. But again, it has lots of holes, which, the IRS calls it initial guidance, so they have a lot to work through. I'm not necessarily calling them out, but there's going to be, a lot of questions, and there's kind of be a knowledge creep, I think, for, a lot of the questions that are out there. So the question, what we want to talk about for the remainder of this presentation is what kind of questions are out there, and what are people wondering. So the first thing that we can talk about is prevailing wage and apprenticeship. One of the big questions here is, what scope of activities does this prevailing wage and apprenticeship apply to? Because at least the initial guidance seems to say, look, we're talking about, project construction, manufacturing, repairs, everything that happens during the credit period. But a lot of practitioners are asking, okay, well, what about, off-site repairs that happen once the project's already up and functional? Is that the kind of thing where I'm having to go, investigate what sorts of wages are being paid on that work that I'm not really involved with? Similar questions for contractors and subcontractors. How closely do I have to be monitoring them? How much control do I have to exercise over, those parties that really, it's not really my business what they're doing until you've now made it my business, IRS, by saying that I have to meet these requirements. A lot of industry groups have started to, give their thoughts on how this should work. For example, the AICPA, the National CPA Society, I think for that contractor and subcontractor issue has suggested, some sort of good faith reliance standard, which would ease the burden on project owners and investors to say, look, you're a contractor, you know that we have to hit these requirements, you're representing to us that we have through you and the work that you've done on the project. And as a result, that good faith reliance allows us to make this representation and access the bonus, or not the bonus, but the larger base credit. They've also suggested that there should be the ability to avoid penalties for saying that you meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements if you don't, if you have that good faith reliance. Not totally clear that the IRS is actually going to allow that. Sometimes they're not very forgiving, even when practically, there's no really other alternative. So we'll see. Domestic content is one that, the phones have been ringing nonstop for the past couple of months on. There are some very granular questions, but even at, its most basic, the 40% US made test that's applied to manufactured products, what does that actually mean? How far up the supply chain are project owners to be looking? Because, when you look at a product, that has a subproduct, a subproduct, a subproduct, and where does the kind of merry-go-round stop? One thing that I will say on this, and it's kind of informed by a lot of the calls and questions that we've been getting, is you want to be very careful. I'm not sure if we have any. Most of the calls, frankly, that we've been getting on this are from manufacturers and suppliers, because there's competition in the marketplace. They want to be able to say when you buy our products, they're domestic content. So when you use them in your project, they're contributing to you hitting your metrics. The problem is, a lot of times that's not the case. We were talking recently to a company, not in the U.S., somewhere in Canada, that manufactures a product that is used in a lot of solar projects, and they were saying, look, as our operations currently stand, we're not sure that we can make a representation that our products are domestic content, and that's going to really hurt us in the marketplace. Can we be setting up some sort of factory in Michigan, or can we edit this part of how our supply chain works? But you really want to be careful whether we do have suppliers in the room who are working through that, or if you're an investor and an owner who is relying on advice from those people, because what it's culminating down to is the suppliers all want to give basically tax advice to their customers and say, either A, this is domestic content, trust us, which you shouldn't be trusting them because they have obviously an interest in selling you the product, or B, it's not domestic content, but don't worry, it's a very small part of your project. You're going to have no problems hitting the domestic content percentage, and we'll give you a nice price. Both are problematic if you are using that as the base for buying that and trying to get the domestic bonus credit or the domestic content bonus. Can be a big issue. So please try to hire a tax advisor if this is something that you're going after, because there's a lot of people giving tax advice that shouldn't be giving tax advice. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll skip the energy and low-income communities one, but I will note that 2023-17 notice that I issued, or that I mentioned a little bit earlier on low-income communities, is fairly useful. Still has some holes, but we'll have some base answers. And then, I think the biggest thing, and there's a lot of really complicated tax questions in this space, is the credit transferability. Especially the tax questions get very thorny, as they always do, when you're dealing with pass-through entities, partnerships, and S-corps. Which we almost always are in this space, at least in the portfolios that we deal with. There are all sorts of questions, from as base as, can a non-paying tax entity like a partnership or an S-corp be the buyer of these credits? Is that permissible? Okay, if so, what if they have some partners that hypothetically are eligible for direct pay? Or what if, how far can we go in allocating these credits once purchased by a pass-through entity amongst the partners? Are we able to do some nice special allocations to get the credits where we want them to go? Do they have to go in accordance with partnership interests? How creative can we get in our drafting? And those sorts of questions, frankly, I think the IRS is not likely to give very clear guidance on, which is why lawyers are the cockroaches of the energy space. Will never go away because you need us to write some opinion for you about how these allocations can work. Also, things as base as how are penalties going to work in this partnership space? Because you might know there's a special partnership audit regime. The IRS is for like excess credit transfers or things like that. The IRS has indicated that your typical reasonable cause standard applies, but there's no good faith aspect to that, which is getting a little bit heady tax. But it is, there's a lot of questions. Right now, not many answers. Dan Spitzer, who normally talks, likes to say that everyone's just making it up right now, doing whatever they want and hoping that the guidance comes down in their favor when it comes out. But there's a lot of stuff that will be happening over the next couple of, I say couple of months. It's probably going to be a little bit longer than that, given IRS timelines. But we'll see what happens. If you're working through questions on any of these IRA changes, first, you're not alone, and second, happy to help. I think I'm already over on my, I'm 5 minutes over. All right, I'm getting out of here. Sorry. Apologies. Thanks, everybody. It was great to be here. Great seeing everybody.